always. So I thought it would be interesting to uh, basically shift over towards economic theory. And I know some of you have not studied economics, but that's okay. My point being that much of economic theory today is, particularly microeconomic theory, is very much caught in a certain normative corset or straitjacket or what have you that really keeps it from including aspects of behavior that are, well, less, that pertain less to that type of behavior. So again, we've been focusing on cooperation, and much of economic theory is focused on conflict, or rather is very ambivalent. So it assumes that people are very indifferent and don't consider things like morality and so on. So we wanted to look at a few foundational texts and a few ideas that maybe point in a different direction. People are not indifferent, and maybe that norms matter. So that's the point. So I wanted to start. I also put one slide at least at the end. We'll get to that um, because this is actually quite short. So we start with the so-called Smith problem, which sometimes is called das Smith-Problem, because actually in the German literature there's a large debate that's been ongoing, basically since Adam Smith traveled over from Scotland. At least his books traveled over from Scotland, and people started reading them on the continent. So, and this Smith problem basically can be summed up with this idea that many perceive that there are two Adam Smiths. Of course, Adam Smith was, is considered by many the founder of political economy, and in many ways a grandfather of modern economics. And many, liberal free market supporters clutch Adam Smith under their arms and sleep with him by their beds and so on. And so, in any case, it's very interesting because Smith is saying very different things in these two main works, in these two main books that he wrote. So in 1759, he wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is basically a book of moral philosophy. And in fact, Smith was a professor at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland of moral philosophy. He was not a professor of economics because I guess economics didn't exist yet. So yes, this is what he was writing and lecturing on, was morality, ethics. What does it mean to be good, good actions. So this is his first major work. About 20 years later, he publishes this inquiry into and so on and so forth. The Wealth of Nations is what it's known to us moderns, 1776. And in the first book, basically, he is very much concerned with tracing out the effects of and causes of and implications of sympathy. Uh, Whereas in the second book, The Wealth of Nations, it's very much founded on the notion of self-interest. So he has this statement that, the butcher and the baker don't give us their meat and bread because they really like us, but, because we pay them. So it's very interesting to contrast these two points of view. And I have a quote here from one of the books that was in our first set of readings by Amitai Atzioni. You can't really read the Atzioni at the end there, but it says, the fact that the position Smith took in moral sentiments is not easily reconcilable with the one he took in The Wealth of Nations has generated a small industry of writings interpreting the differences and generating ways to solve what has become known as das Smith-Problem. Suffice it to say here that most neoclassicists and contemporary Whigs, that's maybe just a bit of a joke, tend to ignore the first Adam Smith in favor of the latter. Similarly, they are familiar with the works of Amartya Sen, Albert Hirschman, who I mentioned yesterday, and others. However, they tend to ignore their implications for the monoutility neoclassical paradigm. What does he mean by monoutility? I was discussing his appeal for a co-determination theory, so he's saying just this P-utility, this notion of utility as being the only thing that drives behavior. And neoclassicists ignore, uh, other aspects of theories by people like, even like Adam Smith that they cite. So let's look at the theory of moral sentiments. I assigned the first two chapters, which are very short. They're both about 2 or 3 pages. And these two quotes both come from the first chapter. So first of all, this is, I think, the very first sentence actually in the book. How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. So, in a sense, Smith is outlining what has been become known as social preferences, um, very clearly. So, this appears to oppose the notion that people are just self-interested. Um, and of course, he develops this idea throughout the book of the principle of sympathy. How is it that we consider the fortunes of other men, as he says here, or the fortunes of others? By the imagination, he says, we place ourselves in his, I guess you could say, her situation. We conceive ourselves enduring all the same torments. We enter, as it were, into his body and become in some measure the same person with him, and thence form some idea of his sensations and even feel something which, though weaker in degree, is not altogether unlike them. So again, very much focusing on these social feelings, emotions, sentiments, and stressing the importance that they have in our behavior. It's a very strange thing that Smith has been associated with the invisible hand and laissez-faire capitalism. Okay, that was just a quick overview. Moving on to Sam Bowles. There's also the book this week, today, sorry, on the moral economy. I've already mentioned it. I think I mentioned it yesterday. So I wanted to focus on one particular idea in the book. And actually, I wanted to do later, if we have time, a little bit of a reading exercise like we did yesterday, this sort of group discussion on two examples in the book. So basically, Bowles is contrasting throughout this book the theories of David Hume, another Scottish philosopher of the Scottish Enlightenment, with Machiavelli, who was a bit earlier, was an Italian uh, thinker, politician, advisor of the Medici in Florence in the Renaissance. And so Hume has this view of legislation, rules, incentives, external, again, going back to Ellen Ostrom, these rules or enforcement mechanisms. So he says, in contriving any system of government, each man ought to be supposed to be a knave. A knave is a fool or an idiot, so to speak, and to have no other end in all his actions than private interest. By this interest we must govern him, and by means of it make him, notwithstanding his insatiable avarice and ambition, cooperate to public good. So you can very clearly read between the lines and see what Hume is saying here, and saying actually when the legislator is designing a public policy or a law, he should or she should definitely assume that everyone is corrupt and selfish and so on. So to contrast this with Machiavelli, who says that neither laws nor orders can be found that are enough to check a universal corruption, for as good customs have the need for laws to maintain themselves, so do laws have the need for good customs, so as to be observed. So he says very much something different. So basically, if you assume that people are corrupt and you create laws as such, then, well, people will, over the long term, be corrupt. In a sense, he's focusing on the area of culture which he calls here custom. So if you create these laws, then in the end, people will change their beliefs according to the assumptions that are signaled. This is also from Bowles' book. It's a graphic. It's supposed to represent a theory, I would say. And again, I say here separable preferences and crowding in and out. What do I mean by that? Or what does Bowles mean by that, rather? So basically, he's contrasting the standard theory in economics with something that he's developing in accordance with what people like Machiavelli are writing here. So we can say the first image represents the views of David Hume. This idea that preferences, what people desire, if they would like more beer or if they would like more peace or less pollution or whatever it is, we have preferences for certain things. And the idea that Hume is expressing here is that these incentives, the laws, have no negative impact or positive impact. They exist as if in a separate dimension, as this notion of social preferences or custom. So you see in this picture A, you have separability where the incentive is not working upon the experienced values that the individual has. It in fact only operates on the cost of contribution. So basically the incentive could be a tax, it could be some sort of a fine, whatever it happens to be. It's some law that states, if you do this, then this happens. And in fact, basically, these two channels are operating separately. It's like there's a wall between them. And in the end, you have the positive effect of the values and the negative effect of the incentive, and then whatever comes out. So people pay their taxes. So moving on to this second picture, B, this is where Bowles says, actually, it is often the case that these preferences are non-separable. So in fact, the incentive has a direct impact on the values that people experience. So by setting a tax at a certain level, the legislator may be communicating mistrust of the citizenry. So in fact, seeing that there's a certain fee to use something, say, that's been freely available to everyone throughout the years or whatever it happens to be, in fact, then is perceived by the citizen as an insult, or it's perceived as a signaling mistrust. So in fact, it does not only impact the cost of contribution, but it also impacts the what he calls here experienced values. How what do people think of me? How am I perceived? And so in the end, it's affecting both channels. And so, in fact, the public good contribution in the end, how many taxes I pay, could be even lower than what would be predicted if, in fact, these two things were completely separate. So here, this is supposed to represent this in another way, so you can understand. And there's an X and Y graph here. On the X axis, you see the size of the incentive. So that could be, again, a fine or a tax of some sort to use some type of good. Or say it could be a sanction. If you're late for work for 5 minutes, you get €5 of sanctions if you're late for, and so on. Maybe it could increase. If you're 10 minutes late, you get €20. So it keeps going up. And again, this notion of the contribution of the public good could be people appearing on time. And so if we have the separable preferences, which is the very top line, it just shows a linear relation between the incentive and the contribution. So you see people, in fact, react to the fine. They come to work on time. And these other lines show actually what the situation looks like when there is either weak, what he calls weak crowding out, or strong crowding out. You don't have to understand the mathematics of it, but the point is basically that there are perverse effects of incentives, and they sometimes actually counteract the initial goal. And one should always include or incorporate these secondary effects, or the effects actually on signaling how people perceive themselves as being uh, uh, represented. Does this make sense?
I don't really understand the graph right now. Maybe you could explain, for example, why the marginal crowding out is looks like it looks like.
Well, the marginal crowding out is a very weak crowding out. It means actually that the preferences are not very uh, inseparable. That means that actually, in some cases, you may still have a positive impact for setting a fine for people being 10 minutes late or 5 minutes late. There is a weakened effect because, in fact, people are insulted. They do feel, in fact, my boss does not trust me. And so, they may just be 2 minutes late or 4 minutes late because the fine only appears if you're 5 minutes late. So if you're 4 minutes late, there's no fine. But in a sense, again, you're communicating your dissatisfaction with this fine. So that would be an example of this marginal crowding out. People are not late, but they're not on time and they're not happy. So the example of the strong crowding out would rather be this has a direct impact on my attendance. And so actually, in fact, people then just take the fine. So then, okay, I'm going to be 1 hour late, or if it gets high enough, I just quit. So, in a sense, again, mathematical models are attempting to represent ideas. You don't have to understand the specific, what's the first derivative and the second, and all these sort of things. I'm just sort of throwing these ideas out there. You can return to this literature and familiarize yourself more with it. But the idea is basically, again, that the thinking of economists that you can just separate these things out into two worlds and actually see incentives as material incentives in this clean way without considering the ethical implications and communication and these aspects of it is absurd. So yeah, just basically focusing on these two things: the marginal crowding out, this line that Charlotte mentioned, and the strong crowding out is a good representation. So the point being that if you design a policy well, you would consider the effects of the policy on the perceived beliefs of people. So what is this policy saying about me? And without doing that, Bowles is saying you're creating naive policy because it's really counteracting what it's trying to impact. Does that make sense?
So can I try to explain this in an example? I'm not sure whether I understand. So for example,
Yes.
if people worked in the healthcare sector during the Corona COVID,
Mm-hmm.
and now we are saying, oh, you did a great job, I give you $10. Then the healthcare worker worked just so much and had so many overhours, so that the $10 wouldn't just equal the amount of how much they worked. So the incentive would have been the opposite direction, because normally you would have said, okay, now you should be happy you got $10, but the healthcare workers think now, oh shit, $10, why have I done this all? Because now they think, oh, all I've done, it was just worth of $10, and normally I would have done it just because of my social norms to help and get
Exactly.
due
Exactly. That's actually you're thinking very
prices.
well ahead, basically, about this. And I wanted to do these two chapters, or not chapters, but examples. And what you're saying, actually, Frederick, is you're basically describing the very first example, this the Boston firefighters. But I think I will, unless I was just thinking in terms of planning, moving on to the next, basically finishing the presentation or the lecture, and um, and then going back to these examples. But I think it'll become clear once we discuss these examples from the book. I think we'll do it like we did yesterday, where one group reads the one example, the other one the other, and then we explain it. So I think exactly what you're saying. It's this idea that the incentive, this €10 for the the care workers, is perceived as an insult. In fact, as you say, people are doing this type of work because they have a moral conviction that it's important to do, and a very small material incentive can then be perceived as an insult. So perhaps a large material incentive would compensate for the minor insult that giving the material incentive would have, but a very small material incentive would just signal, this is this isn't worth the basically this insult, or this perceived insult. So yeah, that's exactly the perfect example. So again, we will come back to this in a bit, but just want to move on. Firstly, to norm and act-based rationality. This is a paper by Robert Aumann, who also is a recipient of the, again in quotation marks, Nobel Prize in economics. And this is quite a recent paper of his. I think it's from, oh goodness, I don't remember. It's 2009 or something. It's not very old. So Aumann actually is trying to build a bridge between what he calls mainstream economics and behavioral economics. It's a very short paper. It's only 5 pages. He suggests that mainstream economics is based on act-based rationality. So that can be perceived as utility maximization, what we discussed in the very first session. This is the standard theory that you find in economics, also in some other disciplines like political science generally. And in fact, behavioral economics, which has come up and arrived in the last 20 years or so, is based on what he calls rule-based rationality. These are heuristics that tell us, what to do. Things like, eat when you're hungry, or if you are playing a sport, you keep the ball between the line of sight and the horizon. People who are playing sports, they're not calculating the angle of the ball and the velocity and this type of thing. They usually have some type of a rule of thumb in their mind, and that's how you catch the ball or throw the ball and whatever else. So again, that's just to represent this notion of rule-based rationality versus act-based rationality. And basically says both of these are rational. So there's always the debate within these circles, what is rational? And the notion that psychological research or behavioral research is showing people being irrational, when they overeat or they don't behave in ways that this utility maximization would predict. And what Aumann says, in fact, these two uh, types of behavior are not at all in contradiction. And he says, actually, you can combine them to create a general theory of behavior. In fact, people act uh, generally by way of heuristics. So this is in the normal situation of everyday life. When we're late for work or we're running to catch a train, or in everyday life, when we're shopping in the supermarket, we're acting based on rules. So we say, oh, I bought this product before, it was good, the price was good, so I'll buy it again. Or, it was quicker to go this way last time, so I'll go this way again. However, when we are confronted with uncertainty uh, or untypical situations, it's then that we switch to, as Aumann says, the utility maximization. So again, both of these are correct, and it's just a matter of discovering the context. So this is the last slide for today. No, it's actually not. I added something else. Um, the The Principle of Mutual Aid is a book by Pyotor Kropotkin, who is a very fascinating individual. And again, this is on social inclinations. So I felt this was an important text. I added it later. He died about, I think, 1921. So he was, that gives you an idea of when he lived. I don't remember exactly when he was born. But he was actually a Russian prince. He was very much high in the nobility uh, in Russia, but actually was a political radical. And so he abandoned a court career in St. Petersburg and decided to travel to Siberia and just analyze the biology there, the flora and the fauna. So he studied animals and plant life. He studied human civilization in this really challenging place in the world where it's very cold and there's not very much vegetation. And you have to remember at this time when he's writing, it's the time where Charles Darwin is, has released his On the Origins of Man, or The Descent of Man and the Origins of Species. And so there are a lot of debates in society about science and about evolution and about um, yes, all that entails. So really, again, I mentioned this theory of social Darwinism was very much popular at the time. People were describing capitalism as a system that is the result of evolution and that it is a mechanism for determining the survival of the fittest and so on. So in fact, Kropotkin is looking at this world in Siberia and seeing very much cooperation, sympathy, interdependence, and and the presence of and persistence of solidarity and also mutual aid, both in human societies there in this really cold wilderness, but also in animal species and also plant life. So his conclusion was that again, or one of his conclusions rather, was that in this chapter that I assigned, the centralizing power of the state did destroy many of the foundations on which the solidarity existed, by anonymizing transactions or interactions rather. So, we get agglomerations of people living in cities and really, a loss of the comfort of village life and, direct interaction. But he says, actually, despite all of the centralizing, this principle of mutual aid is still strong and guides very much human behavior. And he looks at examples like volunteer work, even the adoption of orphans. And he says that, in fact, it's interesting to see that even very poor and impoverished families will adopt children from strangers. And he says these are all, behaviors, and you have mutual aid societies, cooperatives, and so on. He says these are all examples that show, it's not true merely to suggest that people are in a state of competition and it's the laws of nature and so on. There are also other aspects of human behavior. So this is from the conclusion. He says, in short, neither the crushing powers of the centralized state nor the teachings of mutual hatred and pitiless struggle, which came adorned with the attributes of science from obliging philosophers and sociologists, could weed out the feeling of human solidarity deeply lodged in men's understanding and women's, of course, and hard because it has been nurtured by all our preceding evolution. So this is basically represents 99% of human history, or even prehistory, and this short period of of capitalist competition is not able to completely destroy those sentiments. So here I just added a sort of a bonus slide because this was actually a rather short lecture. Charlotte, you asked yesterday about the. It's completely different, a completely different topic, but it just fit here in terms of time. And then we'll go back to the examples by Bowles. So yeah, this is just a very, very rough overview. I don't want to go into too much detail. I even thought of a text that we could look at later in the fifth module that I think could be an interesting peek or view into these different types. So, I mean, first of all, I think the most important distinction between the types of cooperatives is between single and multi-stakeholder. You do see an increasing popularity or consideration for the multi-stakeholder model nowadays. It's very popular. Also in the literature, there are a lot of different studies at the moment and even legislation that's being created. But starting with the single stakeholder model, which is the historical one, the first cooperatives were worker cooperatives and consumer cooperatives that brought together basically the urban poor, workers, as well as basically workers. They were however they cooperated as workers or as consumers. So again, I mentioned the Toad Street store in Rochdale. In England, it was a consumer cooperative, and again, this was accompanied by the rise of quite a few worker cooperatives. You had those associated with Robert Owen, who was actually a wealthy entrepreneur, English. Um, Also interesting to study, who had very an idealistic view about society, and including workers in decision making, and even built basically towns. He built entire towns for his workers, even in the United States, and his uh, fabricas. What do you say? What's the factories were were organized as worker cooperatives. So under consumer cooperatives, you can also include banking cooperatives as well. Credit unions, and then you have producer cooperatives. These are a little bit different because the members are not necessarily workers. So that's what distinguishes a producer cooperative from a worker cooperative. So the members are always a single class here. So, and of course, in the worker cooperative, the workers are the members. In the consumer cooperatives, what indicates membership is that you purchase things from the cooperative, either goods or services. Like in a bank, you're sort of purchasing, the banking services. And a producer cooperative basically is a little bit difficult to describe because it's a lot of agricultural cooperatives are producer cooperatives. So you may have an enterprise or a firm that in itself is not a cooperative like a farm, that however is uh, cooperating with other similar firms to say market their products or to purchase machines together. So in a sense, it's a cooperative of enterprises. It could be retailers, it could be farmers, um, things like that. Service cooperatives. Again, you could also include a banking cooperative in the service cooperative. So the distinction between a service and a consumer cooperative is a little bit tricky. Generally, I separated this out because a lot of countries have different laws for insurance cooperatives. So they are classified under a completely different scheme. And basically, these are cooperatives that provide services that where the members are the recipients of the service. So that could be the policyholders of the insurance company, for instance. And then two more recent phenomena are the social cooperatives that I find very interesting. I do study them in my dissertation, and the platform cooperatives. The social cooperatives are basically was a development largely in Italy in the 1970s. Um, the original social cooperatives were designed to take over the role of the psychiatric clinics, actually. So, in the course of the 1970s and until the early 80s, Italy's psychiatric clinics were very much controversial because of their um, intransparent policies, the way that people basically were locked away for life in the psychiatric facilities, and there was not a focus on actually improving the welfare of the patients. So a psychiatrist from the north of Italy, Franco Basaglia, basically advocated for their closure, and in fact he was successful, and there are no longer any psychiatric wards in the classical sense in Italy, and other countries have also emulated that. So the social cooperatives basically provide services to they provide them to municipalities, but of course they provide them to the recipients of the service, and they are typically marginalized communities. They can be people who are handicapped, physically, mentally. They could be criminals, people who are formerly incarcerated who need to be reintegrated into society. They could be migrants, people who have problems speaking language. So the point of the social cooperatives is integration. And in Italy, which is sort of the prototypical model, and other countries have adopted similar legislation like Canada since then, you have two types. One of them is provide services to the handicapped and the marginalized, and the other one is actually can basically be anything. It could be, you know, a company, it could be a supermarket, it could be whatever it is, a massage parlor. And the point is always that the worker members are handicapped or marginalized. So the one type provides services specifically to people who are, you know, it could be youth, after school programs, or counseling services, and so on, this type of thing. And the second one really is very broad. It could be any type of business, basically, but its members need to be, the majority, I think, need to be, again, from these marginalized communities. Does that make sense? So again, it's a very interesting phenomenon because you're including, say, municipalities. I'm sorry, actually, I made a mistake. This should be in the multi-stakeholder because generally they are multi-stakeholder. Um, they can be single stakeholder, but generally a social cooperative is a multi-stakeholder model. So as well, so these last two, um, yeah, I made a mistake there actually. The last two should be in the multi-stakeholder category, but as I wrote here, it's a general term. It can be one. It could be one of the above as well. So a platform cooperative is a very interesting term because it's not a legal term. It's not. It doesn't refer to any type of single business. It's really just an umbrella term that describes a movement, I guess, that's arising currently on internet platforms. So people are trying to develop companies or cooperatives that are run democratically that actually um, provide certain services or goods. So this can be anything. I know one guy from the Netherlands. He's building a platform cooperative that is providing solar panels, and not just solar panels, but also the service involved in installing and repairing them. So people basically join the cooperative as members, and they get solar panels for life. You know, if they're recycled, and if they break, you know, they replace them. So it's not, you're not just buying a solar panel, you're basically buying, you know, the entire service, the entire life term of, you know, of solar panels and other things, you know, food delivery, taxi, or, you know, ride share. There's Fairbnb, you know, which is a basically is a competitor to Airbnb, except that it's a, you know, it's a democratic platform and things like this. So it can be very much, it's a very broad term. The members can be users, they can be workers, they can even be municipalities. So the multi-stakeholder model, as I say, can take the form of any of the above, but includes more than one class. So basically you could have, again, as I said, users, service providers, you could have engineers, you could have, the only difference is that a multi-stakeholder cooperative has more than one class: workers and consumers, producers and consumers, users and producers, and so on.